Right. Hello and welcome. My name is Mackenzie Wren. My pronouns are she and hers, and I am with the Southern Jewish Resource Network for Gender and Sexual Diversity. And we go by the acronym SOJOURN, and we are the American South's resource for Jewish and LGBTQ plus programming, education, support, and advocacy. And our mission is to advance LGBTQ plus affirmation and empowerment across the South. Here in Entering the Virtual World, I'm so excited to be here with Peter Isbister for a session on empowering our children to live authentically. And Peter is the founder of Transparent Georgia, which is a group for parents that provides an environment that encourages parents and caregivers to speak openly about their own experiences in raising a transgender, non-binary loved ones. And I'm really excited to have a conversation with you about this topic, Peter. So let's start by having you introduce yourself and some context.
Well, thank you, Mackenzie, and thank you to anyone who's watching. As Mackenzie said, my name is Peter, and I'm the founder and sort of the initiator, the facilitator now of the Metro Atlanta Transparent chapter. And Transparent is a national organization with over a dozen, maybe even over 15 chapters around the country and growing. And our chapter began just in February of this year. And we had a couple of meetings at St. John's Lutheran Church on Ponce Avenue in Atlanta before everything in our universe went virtual. And we now meet on Zoom, and we will be meeting on Zoom until October. And people can find the group at Metro Atlanta Transparent on Facebook and can message me directly, and it'll go into my email if you want to have a little further information or figure out how to attend one of our meetings on Zoom. And so we're essentially a peer parent support group, and the two distinguishing characteristics of our group that distinguish it from other groups and support groups out there in the LGBTQ plus space are that we are really uniquely and only for parents of transgender kids, transgender, non-binary, gender non-conforming. There's of course a lot of vocabulary in there. But if your child were identifying as really clearly as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, there would be another place for you to go. And the other thing is that we're really just for the parents or the primary caregivers, an expansive view of parent. But there are other groups that have space for allies or the significant others of transgender folks. And we're trying to create a space for folks who are living the experience of parenting and raising these kids. And so our group also, at least at the moment, doesn't have a corollary space for the kids themselves. There are a few transparent groups that do have that, and we don't, and I'm not sure if we ever will. But that's our space, and I came to it because I've got 3 kids, and in October of, I guess it was 2018, when one of my kids was just over 5 years old, I have an elder daughter and younger twins. And one of our twins, who was assigned female at birth, came out to myself and his mom as a transgender female to male person. And of course, when we say female to male, I mean, what that has meant at this point has been that he basically led us through what felt to us like very rapid social transition. I guess the last thing I'll say about that is that one of the many things that kind of blew our mind at the time was we asked him how long he had felt this way, sort of how long had this been true for him, and the answer was basically forever.
Yeah.
And so it was a dual thing where it was like water crashing over a dam for him that had been long pent up, and for us it was, in many ways, quite new news that felt like there was this huge transition that happened in a week.
Yeah.
So in that sense, we weren't totally lined, there was a little,
You had to do some catching up.
Yeah, we had to do some catching up. It was a unique part of that first moment.
So you mentioned something really important, which is that the spaces for kids who are clearly identifying as gay or lesbian is a different space. And I think
Yeah.
that's an important distinction to make, because oftentimes, even in LGBTQ plus, right, within that long string of letters is a conflation of gender identity and sexual orientation. And
Right.
group, and as we should be thinking, gender identity, sexual orientation, very, very different things, and need to constantly be separated in order to understand people's experiences, their own experiences, and the difference between their identity and their expression. The other thing I wanted to have you talk about is you used a phrase, assigned female at birth. And I
Yeah.
wonder if you can talk a little bit about that to help us understand the trans landscape, first of all.
Sure. So, you know, my wife was pregnant twice, and the first time she was pregnant, we were a couple that really wanted to embrace the mystery, and we didn't find out what the gender, or, well, I mean, we would have called it gender at that point because we didn't know better, but the sex of our first kid was. And, we learned that in the delivery room. Well, what did we learn? We learned that we had a kid with female genitalia, essentially, to get pretty specific about it. It so happened for that kid that was a match with her gender identity and her whole self-identity. So that, was what most folks expect and experience. When we had twins,
Right, which
was later, a few years later, we weren't into the mystery. We needed to plan our house, right? So we found out. Well, what did we find out? We found out that we had two kids, or two babies on the way, that had, one had male genitalia and one had female genitalia. And when they were born, we gave them basically feminine and masculine names, and everything that would go along with, right, in terms of raising a girl. And what we learned when our child was just over 5 was all of this business about, I'd like to have my hair cut short, or I want to grow up in that other family so I can be that person's brother, or let me wear my basketball jersey to school as many days as I can get away with, was something more than just a masculine girl, but was a person with male gender identity who very clearly to us needed to be embraced as a transgender person to live a healthy life, to live the life that our kid told us was true.
Absolutely. And he was 5 at the time, but he had
just over 5. Yeah.
Yeah. So what did you and Robin
I'm sorry, what did we do first?
do first?
I was actually out of town that very first night, and I think my wife engaged a little bit of conversation and said, "Thank you very much. It's bedtime, and I'll see you in the morning." Is what we absolutely did first. And then she called me, and we had this very intense conversation about, oh my word, our kid is not just a lesbian who's going to get a basketball scholarship to the University of Connecticut, which was sort of what we thought, but we have a trans kid. Holy smokes, right? And so our child, if I recall correctly, I think picked, with my wife's help, picked a name, male name for himself, and was continued with his female name and his female gender identity for the rest of that week at school. And we began to use the male name and the male pronouns at home. That weekend, he got his hair cut very short, and we've got these priceless pictures of him at the hair salon. And on Sunday, he went to Sunday school at the Lutheran church and introduced himself as a boy. And on Monday, he went to school as a boy and has never looked back.
Yeah. May I ask how old he is now?
He is 6.5.
Okay. So
it's September birthday.
Okay, great. So as you have been on this journey, you clearly found the need for some support. And you mentioned that Transparent is a national organization. So what did you find locally? How did you go about finding the information to help your family walk through this journey?
So what we found locally, I'll give Robin, my wife, credit for a lot of what we found locally early on. And just sort of through the parent network, what I affectionately have come to refer to as the mom mafia, uh, we found a couple of other parents, right, in or around our town that, had kids. And I don't think, I know one of them was not at all our kids' age. So there's just, the beginning of that sort of, almost anecdotal social connection. And then we went one night, for those folks who were watching in Atlanta, to sort of a potluck dinner with a group called uh, Southern Fried Queer Pride. And they're at a church sort of closer to Midtown. And, and our kids were by far the youngest, right? So it was sort of a gender diverse potluck dinner. Um, but our kid was quite, we were driving home that evening and asking the kids what they thought. And, my two other kids were like, yeah, it was all right. And my trans kid was like, that was the best thing in the world, because he just knew that even if they weren't little preschool, kindergartners, they were, but he referred to them as, they were all gender, like me.
Nice. Yeah.
Gender people. I said, yes, they were.
Yeah. So, so from there, from finding that great group, Southern Fried Queer,
Yeah.
I also can't remember what it is. There's some wonderful people in there, but
Yeah.
then you decided to go take it a little bit further and initiate this group, which began when, by the way?
Well, I started, exploring it in the sort of late fall of last year, and again, we had our first meeting in February of this year.
Yeah.
And I think there are two sort of quick things I can say about why. One was, I actually feel like we were operating from a place of a fair amount of strength. Rob, my wife and I were very clear. We got a lot of support at school, a lot of support from Congregation Bet Haverim, a lot of support from St. John's Lutheran Church, a lot of support from our families. So we were not in crisis, right? We were in a position of strength, and I think wanted only to strengthen ourselves, but also to, I wanted to demonstrate that strength and pride to my kid. And I wanted to try to sort of export that strength, into the community. And I also know that, though it was fairly, easy, in many ways for us, that it's not necessarily easy in the Southeast. And if it's easy, inside Metro Atlanta, it may not be as easy in, outside the perimeter in other parts of Georgia. So I just thought, and I guess the last thing was we were aware that the state legislature had some fairly inhospitable things potentially planned for the trans community in that upcoming session. And so we just sort of felt like, for that sort of constellation of reasons, it was important to plant the flag and to see what we could do. And so Rabbi Pamela Gottfried at CBH let me know about this organization. And, it was sort of like, if you want something done, ask a busy person. So I added it to my plate.
And how many parents are involved as it stands right now?
So I think we've probably had about, over the course of the 3 meetings, I would say we've maybe had about, more than 8, but not more than 12, around 10 probably distinct folks who have come. Not everyone comes to every meeting. We had a great press coverage in the AJC and the Georgia Voice and some other places. And unfortunately, we got all our press basically the very same week the state shut down. So that was a bit of a bummer, because I thought we were going to maybe really generate some membership, and people have obviously some sort of higher order priorities. Um, and But we're just going to keep on keeping on. We're just going to keep on being every second Thursday of the month at 7 o'clock. And hopefully, if we just stick in the same place at the same time for a long time, people will continue to find us.
I would actually hope for you all, given that Metro Atlanta, as you said, tends to be more supportive and has more resources, that possibly even moving it virtually might eventually attract some families who are in less supportive environments. And we know that being in the Deep South there's some very real oppression that goes on, and people lose their jobs and have been killed. And we know that there's some real dangers out there. And so hopefully by continuing the virtual presence, there's some additional resources that people can access.
Absolutely. I'm glad you make that point. I hadn't even quite thought about it being from a geographical point of view easier. And I think that's really true. The other thing that somebody in our group mentioned last month was it is potentially easier for a parent who's really struggling, who is, let me be clear, absolutely welcome. We make no judgment or precondition. I mean, you can be like super furious that your kid is trans, or like think it's the end of the world, or not know how you're going to go on, or how are you going to tell, you're all right with it, but your husband's really not, or vice versa, or your clergy person that you're close to, or your mom, or all that stuff. Like, it's not about just folks like me who are, I'm the logical person to start the group, but I'm not necessarily like the logical only member, right? So somebody said, well, it might be a lot easier for somebody who's kind of struggling. You can log into a Zoom, turn off your camera, turn off your mic, and just sit there, and it might do you a lot of good.
Yeah.
And I would be totally pleased. I think that might have even happened last month. And I'd be pleased to see it continue to happen.
In making that comment about the different kinds of reactions, there's two things that come to my mind, which is one is if you've met one trans person, you have met one trans person. And if you have met a parent of a trans person, you have met one parent of a trans person, and everybody's experience is so very different.
Right.
And that's important to talk about, because there are a million ways to be in our bodies. And there's a million ways that we respond as parents and loved ones to somebody who is having a different relationship with their body than the one that was quote unquote assigned to them at birth.
Yeah.
Right? So I wonder, we've talked a little bit about that kind of landscape, but one of the questions that you and I were talking about before we started was this idea of transitioning, right? Like you have to transition. And let's talk about that a little bit, because that idea of there's a million ways to be trans and to be in our body. So what does transitioning always mean?
Yeah. So, one thing that I learned early, right, is that there is a transition available to, or a series of questions and a pathway for prepubescent kids, right? And that's the social transition. What gender identity do you present to whom? Do you change your name? Do you not change your name? What are you doing with your hair? How do you feel about your body hair? How are you going to dress? So our kid had, his own set of answers to that. And then there's a question of, surgery and sort of more major physical things, which for our family is a few years down the line. And, but so all in all of that space, right, there can be just all sorts of different choices, and people can make it at different times. And, I even think in the last 20 or 30 years, the scope of what's been accessible or available or even halfway safe has changed, so I'm very new to the trans community, so I don't speak about this from a lot of personal knowledge, but I'm sure that there are, sort of generational, divides, but contours to this, right? Where, older trans people might look back at folks who are young and trans now and say, well, isn't that something? You've got that range of choices that I didn't have. We also have, my child has a friend or someone he knows, who's a similar age and who is a little more hesitant to be as socially transitioned as my child is. Yet this person didn't change their name, and I think potentially they're not, weren't out at school. And I remember talking, having this conversation a little bit with my kid, and his comment was, I think he's just not brave enough yet to be what I think my son referred to as a plain boy. He's still sort of bifurcating in the different spaces, and has not, so I think he has a name that's fairly traditionally to one gender, and sort of hasn't seen the need to change it. And I just thought it's such an interesting reaction. Like, sort of my heart goes out to him, right? Like, he is clearly just as trans, but just not quite as brave yet.
Right.
Assessment.
We know that gender exists on a spectrum, right? And so your son really locked into being a boy and knew that that was who. And it's also possible that this other child is somewhere on the spectrum that he's not sure of yet, or they're not sure of, or she's not
right.
sure of, right? And and that trans may be a word that they will not use as they explore their gender identity.
Right. And one of the best pieces, or most intriguing pieces of advice that my wife and I got early on, we got a lot of, oh, you're doing things right, and isn't that wonderful, and how great that your kid can be so clear, yada, yada, yada. But one person said, the only danger that I potentially see in what you're doing is if you overdo the praise and celebration of all of his boyness, and just sort of, oh, you're such a boy. And sometimes I find myself doing that, oh, what a good boy. And I just sort of overdo to try to affirm it. And this person said, well, what happens if, in 5 years or 10 years, your kid kind of moves a little bit more into the gray space, or gets a little, and I think you probably see that in a number of contexts, right? If you make a big change, sometimes people are very, firmly to one side. And, I have no idea what my kid's future is, but I thought it was an interesting piece of advice. Was like, yeah, life is long, and like you say, it is a spectrum, and, I wouldn't. Anyway, it was just an interesting warning, I thought.
Yeah, we talk at SOJOURN, we talk a lot about gender roles, and how do they restrict or constrain or free us. And
right.
So it's interesting within the trans landscape to explore some of those questions, because what does it mean to be a boy? What does it mean to be a girl? And how do we begin to release some of those boxes so that the child can be the child that the child needs to be?
Right.
So I wonder so that raises the question about children and parenting in general. How is supporting your trans kid different from supporting your other two children?
Yeah, so I appreciate this question. And the first thing I want to say loudly is that it's not. And I think it, easy for me to say with the prepubescent kid, right? But I mean, if you're asking for my authentic answer, I just think it's just not, right? Like, all of my kids need me to love them up. All of my kids during the pandemic need to feel safe and secure. They all need for us to try to create some structure and routine for them. And they all need for, my wife and I to understand what needs they need for a connection in a time of isolation. And my trans kid happens to be my most extroverted kid and my most socially connected kid. And, his early experience of the pandemic, again, I don't think had a thing to do with his being trans, but he just wept himself to sleep that first week or the first week and a half, because he was just beside himself to not be with his teachers and his friends. So, what I needed to give to him was assurances that I was going to set up a FaceTime chat with his teacher or whatever I could muster. Yeah, my first answer is that it's not different. But, my other answer, is that it's been important, I think, in the first year to be really ready to come back to the same conversations more than once. That, like every time I go into the bathroom with him, every time, he'll look over at the urinal and be like, yeah, it's not for me. I'm going to go over to this other place here. And we process it every time, or there was an early phase of like, I'm not the only one, right? There are other transgender people in the world. So we had to do some work around like, and that's why we went to Southern Fried Queer Pride, or we, were mindful about creating social connections for him. So anyway, that's some of what we've encountered so far.
Yeah, and then no doubt, like with parenting, all the way through, the needs change as the children.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's just the joy of parenting. I have two.
Yeah, and the other thing that I think he needed was, or that all three of them needed, right, was some guidance around, helping the kids figure out their relationship to each other, right? Because the older sister in their mind, lost their sister. So we had to sort of navigate that. And then there's also sometimes the question of like, well, why does he get all the attention? What about me over here? I got a life with issues too.
Yeah.
Or, how do we deal with like, and this was, the first few weeks more than it is now, but you can be sad, but there are some ways in which, not that you have to watch your sad, but you got to be mindful about the interaction between your sad and your siblings' life. Like, anyway, it's a challenging set of issues for anyone. And when people are like 5 and 9, it took some guidance.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm curious now here in this time of COVID, because this is very real, that it's happening for us. I'm wondering, what are you seeing the impact for the members of your group in the limited time that you've been with them, possibly around access to the medical system and delaying or cancel surgery, or just access to doctors?
Yeah. So, we had one big sort of well-attended Zoom meeting, I guess earlier this month. And a couple of things came up. And I've also, talking to the other transparent chapters around the country. And again, I don't have a whole lot of data, but there was just a mention of, a surgery for a trans person, I think is fairly, first of all, I mean, I think it's my impression is it's not the easiest thing to access across the nation in normal times in terms of, how many providers, sort of competent providers there are for it. But the other was, I don't think it was being deemed a necessary or essential surgery, while hospitals were shifting toward the care of COVID patients. And I can only imagine how anxiety producing that could be for a family, because I'm sure that there's a lot of logistical, financial, psychological, emotional prep to that moment. And then to have that hit by uncertainty would be a challenge. The other sort of thing that people were mentioning, I guess two other things. One was, for the people in our group with the kids who were out of the house for school, all of a sudden, whoopsie daisy, they're back in the house. And so that shows up in all the ways that shows up. And then the last one that I thought was interesting, I think we had one person who was at the beginning of their hormone treatment regimen, which would then trigger, of course, the physical, some more physical transition. And this person said, well, being on sort of forced quarantine was a little bit of a surprise blessing in that, because my child can do that in the privacy of our house. Like there's no expectation that they're out at school or in the world, so they can sort of step back and, do a couple months of hormones and, come back out more fully who they want to be. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Well, so much good information, Peter, that you have been sharing about your experience. And I really hope that the group continues beautifully on Zoom. I think it's an incredibly important offering to the world. And I wanted to say a couple of things. So Sojourn actually has a group for teenagers. I believe it's basically eighth grade through 12th grade. And that is for teens of all orientations and identities. It's called Tum Tum, which is a reclaiming of a Hebrew word. And that Tum Tum group is really a space for support for the teens themselves. Again, not so much the younger children, but for the teens themselves. We are also working on developing a curriculum, which we are also putting out online. Thank you, COVID, but it's the right thing, period, called Sex Ed Queries. And it is sex and health education through a trans and non-binary lens. There's a lot of resources out there specifically for our trans and non-binary kids. So this one is being produced by a young trans man and a queer identified cisgender woman to answer and talk about a lot of different things that come up around health education and sex education. And on the SOJOURN resource page, we have some of those posted, and we're also going to post some links to this YouTube, and certainly this group, your group as well, which is such an important resource, because we know one of my friends became a coach because she went through a very traumatic experience as her daughter transitioned from female to male. And she said she spent a lot of time in the closet crying, and she didn't want other people to have to struggle as hard as she struggled in finding resources. So making these connections across our communities is super important. And I'm so pleased that we had this opportunity to introduce you and the group, and really wish you all the best in continuing. And before we wrap it up, what else do you want to leave us with around any aspect of the transparent group, or about being a parent of a trans child, or whatever words of wisdom to close us out?
Yeah, I'm just going to give another shameless plug, and just that we're Metro Atlanta Transparent on Facebook, that if you send a message to that page, that goes directly to my email account that I maintain for Atlanta Transparent. And I would love to hear from anyone. And it's, very simple to get you hooked up with the group. The only reason that that's there is that, for obvious reasons, I'm not just posting the Zoom link out to the world.
Yes.
And that, if folks, can help us spread the word, if you're so inclined, and like Mackenzie, you were mentioning earlier, it would just make me so happy if I woke up in a year, say, and we had knew that we had touched people outside of Metro Atlanta, or at least, a higher percentage of folks that were struggling. That's really absolutely who we're there for as well, is people at any point, and you can come, you can go, you can come to a meeting and not come to the next meeting and all that jazz. But I really appreciate Sojourn. I appreciate the invitation. And yeah, I guess thematically, we just love our kids, and it's just not any more complicated than that.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Peter, for taking this time. And again, we'll be posting resources, and on the SOJOURN Facebook page, we'll also share the transparent group. And to everybody, right, wash those hands, stay well and healthy, and we'll get through this together. So thank you so much, Peter. It's been a delight talking to you.
Thank you. Same.